Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's session of Beyond the Buy Box podcast. This is an extra special one, bringing a former partner in crime, Sharon Bank, who is a near 30-year commercial executive, vice president of many roles across marketing and client development organization at J&J Consumer slash Kenvue. And Sharon is just a force. She has seen many brands across the entire portfolio. She's touched very deep into the world of client and just knows this world of CPG no better than probably anyone else that I've had the pleasure of crossing paths with when I first stepped into the world of consumer goods at J&J. So I'm pumped.
Thank you. That was such a sweet introduction. Really appreciate it, Jen. And I just loved working with you in sales strategy. I think it was really an interesting space that you and I got to meet each other. It was, that middle space and that intersection between marketing and sales. And I learned a lot from you too. So it was a really fun time when we worked together. And I'm so glad to be back together many years later, but
Yes.
watching you climb in the ranks and try a lot of new different things, it's really inspiring.
Amazing. Well, let's get into it. It's fascinating because the various parts of the business and different angles that you've experienced CPG through your J&J Kenvue career. Take us through any stories or examples where, having been met with a major kind of marketplace challenge.
Right.
What stories kind of come top of mind for you? And tell us a little bit about what happened, like behind the
Yeah.
scenes that nobody may really know, and how did you work through any bumps in the road?
Good question. Well, I've had, as you said, long career with J&J slash Kenvue, but I think the biggest challenge by far came during COVID. And then
Mm.
subsequently after that, the tridemic. And it just rocked everyone's world, right? First and foremost, families, patients, people that are going through that. I mean, obviously, it was a struggle for everyone around the globe and certainly here in the US. But what it quickly became was a real issue with our supply chains. And specifically, I remember Tylenol, was a household staple item, became liquid gold, because
Mhm.
everybody needed it to treat their symptoms, but then everybody wanted it. And it became one of those items that were a panic buy for many households too. And then, you also had, and this was your world for many years, but you had people sweeping the shelf, third party sellers, and then reselling it. So you had that also happening, which was very unfortunate. And we just had such a strong focus. Like we needed to get the medication to those that needed it, right? So I think that was probably the biggest disruption and so many lessons learned through that. But I think the first one was really working internally and we were no longer selling, right? We were really figuring out what we needed to do to get product to the people who needed it. And I think it started with supply chain. And we needed to prioritize our production. We needed to simplify our range. I was really impressed and proud of the company that we focused on smaller sizes because it was really about access. What can we
Mhm.
do to supply the most people with the product who needed it? Then that became, though, which was interesting, as you said, a little bit behind the scenes. Once we had the product, how are we going to allocate it? But, at the time I was vice president of drug and I was working with, Walgreens and CVS, just giants in the industry. And obviously they're on the front line of public health every day. And so you're getting them as much product as you possibly can. You have a fair allocation process. But everybody is getting cut. Like, oh my gosh, I don't know if we could fill like 20% of the orders because the spike in demand was that high. Any kind of
Wow.
forecasted model that we had became instantly obsolete, right? Because the stuff again was liquid gold. So it was really about the strength in those partnerships and the trust in those partnerships. So they trusted that you were allocating product correctly and that you were in there fighting for them as they were fighting for their patients because they were the ones literally on the front line and where people were getting upset if they couldn't find product. So I don't know if you want to dig there. I have more, but we can dig there for
Yeah,
sure.
no. Well, first thing, what I love about the world of J&J is being very centered on the end patient and the end
Yeah.
consumer, especially in a very turbulent time for all of us. Did your approach to how you showed up to the end, consumer and working with drug clients, customers, and helping them sort of merchandise and reach the end consumer in the right tone, in the right way, and taking in context that there was always going to be less then
Right.
available. Did you find yourself kind of leading the team to adjust how further downstream to make
Yeah.
sure still that the right product got in the right hands to the right
Right.
people?
Oh, great question. And I think for us, one of the things we absolutely needed to do is work with our retailers on limits. What do we need to do to make sure that we were getting that product, to your point, in the right hands? So it was really impressive in terms of what the customers were able to do and willing to do. And I'll use Walgreens as an example. I mean, we put a strict limit, but how do you police that in 8,000 stores?
Mm.
They actually moved the Tylenol product off the shelf, the acetaminophen, I should say, because it was all the acetaminophen, including the Tylenol product, off the shelves and behind the counter, to really then make sure, right, that we were getting the product to the right consumers, but making sure that nobody was just sweeping shelves. And taking advantage of this, which is really unfortunate, right? When you see a bottle of Tylenol or acetaminophen out there for, I don't even know, I don't remember exactly what it was, but let's even say $40, right? Like they were exploiting consumers at a very delicate time. So the action that was taken was phenomenal. And then what I learned too during this whole process is just the controls that, the retailers needed to put in too to their stores, because each store manager wanted to pull as much product. So they had to, abort the systems that they traditionally use too, or the way that they would allocate product, to make sure that there was enough geographic dispersion of product.
Mm.
So, yeah, your flagship stores in New York are getting them, but so is the rural store in Iowa. Just for example, that you wanted to make sure that there was equity, that there was fairness, that there was empathy across the board in really trying to treat this and make sure that, again, there was fair allocation, and that you're always keeping that consumer, to your earlier point. And that's why I think I
Mm.
loved and stayed with J&J for so long, is I really believed we operated under that credo in the very first paragraph: patients, consumers, right? So that was our mantra. That was all the decisions were made with them in the front, and our retailers were making that same decision too. So it was a great partnership and lots of learning.
Yeah. Tylenol is such a staple brand for
Mhm.
many, many, many years. And, it's interesting. This example is the first of kind of the reverse. Many of the conversations I've had with folks are tied to arbitrage, but when price and profitability drops, because pricing, it becomes
Yeah.
very, very visible, especially in these online marketplaces, that can often be, a pain point for brands. But this is an interesting one. And actually,
Right.
the reverse, and taking advantage of, high demand, low supply.
Right.
I'm curious in your, brand building endeavors across whichever categories. I think, beauty, baby, there's just lots of action that happens, and protecting the equity of what you're building.
Yes.
We often hear of like these best case scenarios. Maybe take us through any sort of experiences or stories of when things didn't quite go as you had planned,
Yeah.
especially in the arena of protecting all of the work that goes into building a really kind of healthy brand.
Great question. And I think that's where we learn and we grow, right? Is through those failures. And I've had a few humbling experience for sure, but
So,
I think the one that just becomes top of mind for me is back in my marketing days. It's probably when I saw the most of that, when you had to pivot. And for me, I remember when I just started as a manager of Rock Skincare, and it was a brand that we acquired and brought over from Paris. It was in Europe, and launched it here in the US. So, a new brand, many challenges in terms of just making sure that you're communicating your promise to consumers and the relevance and who is this for, and just, getting with the retailers to make sure that you had strong distribution. So we had a very successful launch, and we just wanted to keep that going with innovation and wanted to speed that up. And I think that was our problem, right? You could say speed versus
mm,
substance. And that's where I think was a key lesson learned, because we had worked with R&D. I remember we had this huge, fabulous ingredient that could lift and firm and all the
mm,
things that are very important in the beauty space and the category. But the ingredient that we're using had a medicinal smell.
mm,
And so the aesthetics of it, we had to work to try to mask that. But I will say, as a team and as a company, we really wanted to accelerate the launch of this, because it was a new kind of territory and space that was really developing in mass retail, and claims, key clinical claims backed by dermatologists. I mean, we had so much to communicate, and the promise was so strong. So we accelerated the launch. And and we put it out there in the market. And I think we had some learning in the consumer labs. And I think the lesson learned is that, we should have waited a bit and pushed harder, because once it got into the hands of the consumers, because everyone wanted to try it and they did buy it, but when they used it, it wasn't a delight. And I think in beauty, right, consumers come into this category and they wanted to be delighted by the aesthetics and the usage experience. And so what we learned is, unfortunately, many consumers didn't use it long enough to see the benefit of the science. I think it was some amazing claims, but should have paused a little bit more. So I think that was a really great learning experience. And also, we need to, when we're in those boardrooms, and what are our standards, and just make sure that we're constantly looking at those, because consumers change too in terms of what their needs are, what their expectations are. So it's what they want, what they desire. And, in a category like beauty, you need to make sure you're constantly looking to delight them more than your competitors,
Yeah.
to drive that loyalty and that brand equity that you talk about. And that was a good experience early on in my career. I remember a vice president always used to say to me, keep the consumer at the center. And I think that is something that, I've tried to do over and over. Consumer shopper, just remember who that person is and make sure that you are delivering for them.
Absolutely. Such a great example of taking in the lessons learned. And through that process, because I have no doubt there were many, many people involved in that, especially new formulation. But how did you rally the organization to take in learnings? Because I know it can be very, very tough when something doesn't go as planned, especially when you have a lot of people behind it and involved.
It was really about quickly peeling back the onion, looking at the data to really understand what the opportunities are and what did we miss. And I partnered really strongly with our market research team, who that is their focus, right? They're lasered in on the consumer and making sure they have that research and they have that understanding. And together, I think we really dug into the brand, dug into this innovation. And there were other things going on too with the brand that we just needed to understand as a new brand, what we needed to do to create better relevance with the consumer. And I think having that partnership, and then also partnering then with R&D, who spends a lot of time in the consumer labs, right? Working directly with consumers. I think bringing together that multidisciplinary focus, the voice became much louder in terms of then what we needed to do to set a new path and quickly reformulate.
I love that because, using facts, data
Yes,
to help just anchor in what is reality, I think is so, so, so important.
absolutely. And there's so much data now versus even what we had back then. And I know your company is certainly helping with that as well. I think that the key learning too, though, is not to get too immersed in all that data. Like, you need to be able to find the facts and then move quickly too, right? I think that is the thing that you just don't want to get paralyzed combing through all that data, because you could probably find the answer relatively quickly.
Oh, absolutely. We have a variety of folks who are part of our community, and I always love to ask us if you could leave us with one or two tips, tricks of the trade that, in the spirit of holding on to the sense of a level of control when you put so much effort behind building a brand, or the best possible consumer experience. What kind of advice can you give us that, folks can really take action on?
That's a great question, Jen. When I think about protecting brand equity, and then even as you're coming up with like different campaigns to continue to launch your brand to new consumers, I think the first is just, what is that consistency? Protecting your brand through consistency of information. I was recently reading, and I'm sure you are more up on these facts, but 60% of consumers don't trust AI because there's so much information out there that they just don't know is real. Images, promises, all those different types of things. And for us, I know I was always very focused too, and the company was very focused on what we needed to do to make sure we had that consistency of information and your promise of what you're telling the consumer, that they see that everywhere, especially when you're doing like purpose-led innovation or anything else,
Yeah.
right? Like, they want to see that, and you could work with your retailers to make sure that they're helping in that initiative and that effort. So I think that would be one of the things. And if I could throw one more out at you,
Yes,
because this
please.
was certainly one that was a big focus for many many years, but we needed to make sure that we were proceeding cautiously with influencers. Influencers are great. God knows I watch a ton of them because they're a huge megaphone for your brand, but you're also handing them your reputation. So I think, just proceed with caution and making sure you're using those influencers that are the best fit for you and linked to what you really stand for.
Yeah. Great advice. Great advice.
Awesome.
And also all kind of tied to being really thoughtful and pausing, but keeping the consumer at the center. We're going to snapshot that and use that as our sizzle reel for you, Sharon, because it's a great reminder.
I
Well,
love
it's
it.
been a pleasure
Thank
having
you.
you on today's podcast. And thank you so much for your advice and for sharing very, very candid stories on various sides of the spectrum, which just speaks to your experience, and really, really appreciate it.
This has been just such a pleasure seeing you again, and maybe we can do this again.
Yes,
Love it.
absolutely. All right. Take care.